Good afternoon, and welcome to the first of 3 webinars on Catholic voters and the 2020 election. These 3 webinars are co-sponsored by the Boisi Center for Religion and American Public Life at Boston College, the Greenberg Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life at Trinity College, Hartford, and the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College in Manchester, New Hampshire. My name is Mark Massa, the director of the Boisi Center here at BC, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists for this afternoon's discussion. They are M. Cathy Kaveny, Professor of Law and Theology at Boston College, Cardinal Joseph Tobin, the Archbishop of Newark, New Jersey, and Michael Sean Winters, columnist for the National Catholic Reporter. Welcome to you all, and I'm delighted that we were able to assemble such intellectual star power for this event. After the panelists have had a chance to discuss questions and field some questions from me, I will open up the questions to our viewing participants. Please, when you do use the Q&A function, please address a specific panelist. And if you are a journalist, please name the media outlet that you are associated with. So I thought we would begin this afternoon with a question to Cardinal Tobin. Your Eminence, what issues or concerns will be uppermost, do you think, in the minds of the Catholics in your very large archdiocese when they come to the polls on November the 3rd?
Well, thank you, Mark. I think in order to answer that beyond anecdotally, you have to consider our particular place in the United States, the region where we are. Northern New Jersey and the 4 counties that comprise the Archdiocese of Newark is the most densely populated part of the country. And we are kind of standing on each other's shoulders over here. And we have some particular concerns. Besides being the most densely populated, and really as a function of it, we were after New York City, the hardest hit area of the United States for infections and deaths. I believe our death toll is around 16,000, and we had over 100,000 infections. And so there are many collateral issues having to do with our experience of the COVID pandemic that will figure in people's minds as they go to the polls. Healthcare, the leadership at all levels of society, including the church, during the pandemic, although I don't think they'll be voting on the Archbishop. I'd have to be looking for another job, I think. So that another feature of our particular region is the high presence of people who are born elsewhere, meaning outside the United States. I think there are 5 states that have the bulk of the immigrants in the United States, and one of them is New Jersey. And while we have a great number of Latinx immigrants, we also have very significant numbers from South Asia and from the Philippines. So I think the rhetoric around immigration and immigrants is going to be part of people's minds when they go to the polls. I think recent actions such as attacks on the DACA, Deferred Action Program, as well as even today, or yesterday, I guess, the announcement of renewed aggression against the TPS, or the Temporary Protected Status. We have large Salvadoranian population in the Archdiocese, and we have a large number of Catholics from Haiti. And if they themselves, because they figure in these programs, aren't citizens, they probably have relatives who are. And I can say that this is an area of concern because of just who we are in this archdiocese. And the last area I'd mention relates to both the prior, and that has to do with the economic issues. I think a transversal experience among people who live in northern New Jersey is the incredibly high property taxes. And that burden was aggravated by a federal tax reform cut earlier in the present administration, which actually seriously aggravated the burden that was borne by people in New Jersey, principally because they could no longer declare their federal taxes above a certain point. So I think the taxation issue is always present here. And unemployment, we were second in the nation in unemployment as recently as July. I think we were at 16.2%, and it's receded now to about 13.3, but it's still significantly above the national average. So those would be the three issues.
Great, thank you. Professor Kaveny, I want to ask you a framing question. As a noted Catholic theologian and lawyer, how do you think Catholics should frame the question of who they vote for in November? In other words, is the larger framework about issues or about personalities? Is it about the much written issues and the culture war going on? That's the first part of my question. The second part of my question is, and how do you think they actually will vote?
Okay. Well, I actually have an issue with framing things primarily in terms of issues. It's not that I don't think it's important, but I think it needs to be contextualized and somewhat limited for two reasons. The first is, if you think about what we actually do when we vote, most of the time, unless we're voting for an issue in a referendum, we vote for a person. We don't vote for an issue. We don't vote for, a package of results. And it's interesting if you think about the people we've elected president over, say the past several elections, they've all had to deal with issues or problems that weren't even on the horizon when we elected them. So when we elected President Trump, nobody was thinking about coronavirus, but it's absolutely consumed our attention over these past several months. When we elected Barack Obama, nobody was thinking about the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, but that became the energizing thing. When we elected President Bush, at the turn of the millennium, we weren't thinking that the Twin Towers would come down and terrorism would just consume our attention. So I think issues are important, but I think our main thing should be to think about choosing a person and what sort of person can do the job. Cardinal McElroy, Bishop McElroy, sorry, promotion, but wrote a piece that made this point in America a while back as well. And I think we need to think in terms of competence. Is the person able to do the job? So for President of the United States, even if she were alive, I probably, and an American citizen, you probably wouldn't vote for Mother Teresa for that position, because competence is separate from the second criterion, which is character. Mother Teresa's off the charts on the character issue, maybe not so much on governing the United States. Two other issues, I think I've really focused on the letter C here, is our collaboration. I think it's very important in this time to be able to work with people and not to create, enemies unnecessarily. We need to be able to have leaders who can collaborate with people who are different from them. And then I think the fourth issue is connections. Who are these people that we're considering beholden to? Who do they have as their network of enablers, of supporters, of advisors? So that's one issue. I think that with issues. The other issue with issues is that it's really not clear what the term means. If you think about it, it's kind of a grab bag. It can refer to a complex problem with many causes, climate change or global hunger. we can sometimes talk about an entire section of the economy of the society as an issue, like the economy. We can talk about a morally objectionable specific practice as an issue, like euthanasia or abortion, or even a particular legislative proposal, such as banning capital punishment. That label issue covers all of these sorts of things. And we need to dig deeper and think about how they're related to each other if we're going to get any kind of conceptual clarity. A final distinction I think is important is the difference between important issues on the one hand and urgent issues on the other. And I view this like a house. Shoring up the foundation of your house is incredibly important. If the foundation sinks, the whole house will eventually collapse. But if your roof is on fire, you'd better attend to that first. So one thing we need is leadership that knows how to think about the right balance between important and urgent issues. So that's enough on like how I think we should orient ourselves. I'm a little bit afraid that American Catholics aren't thinking in terms of these issues in particular, or even necessarily competence, character, and collaboration and connections in terms of the voting for the person. If you look at the data, and I think Michael Sean Winters will be able to say more about this, the American Catholic vote looks very much like the American vote overall. So especially with the case of white Catholics, we tend to vote according to our economic and social location and our party affiliation. So what we should do and what we are doing, may be pretty far apart.
Great, thank you. Michael Sean, I'm actually going to give you a choice. You could either start by picking up where Cathy just left off. You want to make a comment about the Catholic vote, or the question I had prepared for you was about the famous document, Faithful Citizenship, which the US bishops issued a number of years ago. Last November, the US bishops announced that abortion was their quote unquote preeminent concern in the American political discussions. But that statement would appear to emphasize a very different set of standards from the way Faithful Citizenship framed the question, which focused on Cardinal Bernardine's famous seamless garment metaphor in approaching life issues. What does this say about the document Faithful Citizenship, both its strengths and its weaknesses? I'm giving you a rare chance to either respond directly to Dr. Kaveny, or you can talk about Faithful Citizenship.
Well, let me do the Faithful Citizenship, and I think it will relate back to what Professor Kaveny was saying. So the problem with, and just to be clear, the preeminent language was added to the document Faithful Citizenship. This is a document that was first done in 2004. It has been updated every time with a letter or something like that. And I think Professor Kaveny just showed some of the kind of structural limits, which is it focuses pretty much on issues. The problem with preeminent, though, was illustrative. So this was added at the last minute by the drafting committee. And traditionally, this has been brought up and has been refused in advance by the administrative board and the drafting committee, because it's not actually what our church teaches, because this is a document about forming consciences, and here they are making a very prudential judgment about what is or is not a preeminent issue. And in defending it, one of the bishops said, well, we're so close on the Supreme Court to being able to overturn Roe v. Wade. There's nothing in church teaching about close or not close on the Supreme Court, and it's that kind of political punditry that has begun to affect the way the bishops speak about Catholic involvement in the political life of the nation. And I think that's very unfortunate, because you've had in the last 40, 50 years in Washington, the emergence of all these special interest groups. And so if you work at the Bishops' Conference, you may, and you're on the pro-life committee, you're going to have common cause with some other groups, but those other groups are not charged with teaching on behalf of the church. They're trying to get stuff done, okay? Same with anti-poverty groups or environmental groups. And I think it behooves the bishops to really take a step back and say, we have to teach what the church teaches. The most egregious example of this may have been, or most recent was certainly preeminent, where it was juxtaposed in the same paragraph with something Pope Francis had said, which was, of course, abortion is enormously important, but equally sacred. Well, if something is equally sacred, it's not preeminent, right? I mean, this was what the tension was. But I think, another example of that would be intrinsic evil, which was introduced all the way back in 2004, and is not a proper, it's a category mistake, right? The fact that something is intrinsic doesn't tell you whether it's important in terms of the public life of the nation. And so lying is an intrinsic evil. And yet we only criminalize it when it's perjury or fraud or slander, when it involves some issue of justice, not if, a beloved one gives you dinner and says, isn't this the best macaroni and cheese you've ever had? And you say, well, of course it is, but it's actually not, okay? This is not a fit moral category. So I think the bishops have to scrap faithful citizenship. The current underlying text was adopted in 2008, so it does not include the magisterium of Francis or Benedict, because his social encyclical came in 2010. They need to start from scratch. And I think they really have to think about what they want to teach. I'm so tired of being told that Catholic social teaching is the best kept secret. It's time to make it less of a secret and make sure that in our seminaries and in our Catholic schools, it is being taught.
Okay, the first unfair question of the afternoon, Michael Sean. What does it mean that they did not take Pope Francis's words into the revision of their document?
Oh, they did. They kept this phrase of his that equally sacred are these other issues, but then you just said something, one of them is preeminent. So if it's preeminent, it's not equal. That was the problem.
Great, okay, thank you. Cardinal Tobin, in the second grade, I had to memorize the 10 Commandments in preparation for eventual confirmation, and one of the most important of those is the commandment that says, I'm the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. Meaning, at least as Catholics have understood it, that our faith comes before everything else. So our faith comes before politics or economic concerns or patriotism or that long list. Do you think most American Catholics actually observe that commandment when they vote in presidential or other elections?
Well, I think it's a great challenge for us. And let me try and illustrate what I mean with an experience I had shortly before I came to Newark in January of 2017. I was at a dinner party and sitting next to a lovely lady who I think didn't know quite what to ask me, to keep the conversation going. So she said, what do you think is the biggest issue facing the Catholic Church today? And I didn't hesitate. I said, the chasm between faith and life. And she looked rather surprised. She said, I didn't think you'd say something like that. I said, well, you probably thought I had some hot button issue in mind. But what I was trying to describe was a complex problem, I think, or at least as far as where it originates. I think in many ways in this country, we are encouraged to privatize our faith, and to relegate it to an hour maybe, I sometimes try to, I usually pray early in the morning and try to pray rather fervently and ask and quietly. And then at the end of the day, I realized that I spent a good portion of the day as a practicing agnostic. I took it all back and said, well, I'll take care of this now, God, the rest of it, I'll see you at the beginning and the end of the day. So instead, as a result, at least in our political lives, I suspect for many of us, we identify first and maybe unconsciously with our particular political or ideological identity. And we allow that to inform the practice of our faith, when it really should be the other way around. I mean, Pope Francis makes it pretty clear that the way I act in society and our political lives must be seen as an essential element of the call to holiness. So that when I make my choices and even think about making that choice, I have in mind, well, what do I, as a missionary disciple of Jesus Christ, need to do or need to seek in this, need to advocate in these circumstances, rather than make that as sort of you know, the worst would be to make one's religious identity or faith to instrumentalize it to support one's politics. You know, and I think there have been some recent examples in the public square where that happened, you know, regarding the Word of God and other things, you know. So I like to think that our act of voting is an act of discernment. You know, it's reading the signs of times and places in the light of faith. So this is what I think my country is facing, or my state, my municipality. But how do I read that now as with relationship to the ultimate claim in my life, which is my life with the one who made me, redeemed me, and sanctifies me.
Good. That's an excellent observation. Cathy or Michael Sean, do you want to add anything to what His Eminence said here about this, the first and greatest commandment?
I think one of the what I hear the echo there is the longstanding communio critique of American politics, which is if you expect us to leave our dogmas at the door as a condition of civil peace, then inevitably religion is reduced to ethics. And I would say we've taken it a step further and then reduced it from ethics to politics, maybe even the legalisms. I could have been we were talking about preeminent. We could have been talking about religious liberty, which again, it's been reduced. Not, you know, what the bishops have been saying about, or some of the bishops have been saying about religious liberty is not preaching Jesus Christ and Him crucified, but James Madison and Him justified. And that's not our teaching. That's not Dignitatis Humanae. James Madison in the Federalist Papers. So I think he's onto something that's very important, and that gets to, that's the kind of observation that they need to start their redrafting of faithful citizenship with.
But I think there's also something else. I mean, when we as Catholics go into the public square, we're not going in as a Catholic political party. Our faith isn't a political party. It's something that informs all aspects of our lives. And part of what we need to do, though, is also ask ourselves, given the polity that we live in, which is religiously pluralistic and morally pluralistic, what do we owe people who believe differently than we do? We're not a lobby group trying to just, well, we've got the Catholic view and we're pushing it, you know, as if we were in favor of, cheese or cigarettes or something, you know. So one of the big questions I think that we need to ask, and that hasn't been asked, is what do we owe people who think differently than we do? And that is a very nuanced question. On some things you owe religious liberty. In fact, the whole orientation of religious liberty wasn't about protecting me and mine, but at least as much about saying, what do I owe those people who are vulnerable, who are in a marginalized tradition, who need protection from the majority? So I'd like us to ask the whole set of questions, not simply one set of the questions that Catholicism can raise, which is like, you know, to what degree are we conforming or not conforming to bits and pieces of the catechism?
Good. Since you're on the screen, Cathy, let me also sort of give back to you the opportunity to reflect some more on something that Michael Sean brought up about intrinsic evil. Now, intrinsic evil has a long and quite distinguished pedigree in Catholic theology. And a lot of Catholics today use that phrase quite a bit about certain specific acts.
Yeah.
And that has taken on a life of its own. Do you want to go anywhere?
Sure. Michael Sean really started that correctly. So in moral theology, the technical manuals of moral theology, intrinsic evil refers to an act that is wrong by reason of its object, not by reason of its circumstance. bottom line, it means that it's always wrong. It doesn't mean, as Michael Sean said, that it's gravely wrong. So lying is an intrinsically evil act. Not even, every intrinsically evil act violates justice. Some intrinsically evil acts do. Intentionally killing the innocent, like abortion, would be an intrinsically evil act under the manualist tradition. But you can have negligent drunk driving that's not intrinsically evil. I mean, or drunk driving, let's say, isn't intrinsically evil, but it's gravely evil. And the vast majority of circumstances, it's wrong. So the term really doesn't help move into the public square, because we don't criminalize minor intrinsic evils like lying, or even like sexual acts like masturbation is an intrinsic evil. I haven't noticed a movement to criminalize that. Maybe there is one on the internet, but I haven't seen it yet. So then how did it become such a prominent term? Well, I think this is about the convergence of American prophetic rhetoric and Catholic casuistry. Whatever else, the term intrinsic evil sounds really bad, right? Intrinsic evil. You can almost, hear the resonances of menace. And the same thing with another term that is a technical term of Catholic moral theology, which is cooperation with evil. Anytime you facilitate someone else's wrongdoing, you're so-called cooperating with evil. Sometimes it's permissible, sometimes it's not permissible. You've got to go through a very complicated analysis according to the manualist, which I won't bore you with now. But the fact is, it sounds really bad. So what worries me is that some of the activists, including some of the people that should know better, are co-opting technical terms of moral theology and using them to manipulate voters, really. Because if you're misusing the term, because you want to get a particular result out of it, I don't think that's a fair way of dealing with your fellow Catholics or your fellow citizens.
Michael Sean or Your Eminence, do you want to add anything there?
I'd just say, and this is not on you, Cardinal Tobin, because you were not a bishop in the United States back in 2004. That's when intrinsic evil was introduced, and it was specifically to differentiate between abortion and capital punishment and to prioritize abortion. And that is exactly the kind of instrumentalization of the faith that the Cardinal warned us against. And that was, I remember that. And I remember talking to a staffer at the CDF who just said, oh, it's complete nonsense. And yet it is still there. It is still a central part of that document. Because once something's in, it's really hard to take it out without it looking like you're backsliding. So.
Yeah, and I think that, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, one term when I did start coming to meetings in 2012, 2013, I guess, I was really surprised how the word, the two forms of cooperation were being batted around. And a lot of the justification was laid at the feet of St. Thomas Aquinas. I believe the distinction came from another saint, St. Alphonsus Liguori, who was a moralist in the 18th century and had some influence in the church.
And it's one of your guys, I believe.
I believe his picture is right behind me if you look up past my fat head. But, and I think it was not it was a way to help people live in ambiguity. That things were not as clear cut as some of the manualists at his time, who were heavily influenced by a Jansenistic tradition, were maintaining. Because he came to this conviction, I think, because he listened to people. And he listened particularly in his day in the confessional. And he realized that particularly the poor and we would say today the marginalized people didn't have a chance at holiness because they didn't have a way of navigating in the ambiguity of their lives. And the notion that there could be some relationship with things that were not moral or not good, but it didn't necessarily mean that they were culpable. And I think that distinction between formal and material cooperation evolved that way.
That's great, and that's so totally correct. I mean, reading the manualists.
Why don't you tell people what the manualists are, Cathy?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so because Catholics had to go to confession, and because there was no internet way back, you know, when the norm was made, you had priests who were scholars who would write these books, which would consider in detail various sorts of action and assess how serious, whether they were sins and how serious they were. You know, and what's great about them is that they take seriously, as the Cardinal said, you know, the challenges faced by people in day-to-day life. You know, some people complain, and there is, I suppose, some justification to that, oh, they're legalistic, they're too focused on specific acts. So I think that is a fair criticism to some extent. But what I think is important is that they recognize that we are living in a world where we need, you know, to make some decisions, and those decisions aren't always clear cut.
Let me do this will be my 7th grade question. The church perhaps has not been as good on dealing with the nuances and complexities of the moral life as it might discuss. No, you know, so in other words, do you think that's an issue in terms of how we as Catholics prepare for voting?
Who's this to?
I'll jump in. I think that I'd say this, and I would refer everyone to an article. I think Cathy mentioned Bishop McElroy's article already and said it was in America. I think it was actually at National Catholic Reporter in February.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. But
stuff. Okay, go on. Yeah.
And he did, in addition to raising the issues that she mentioned, that it's not just issues. You vote for character and competence and these kinds of things in selecting a candidate. He did point out that the issue of climate change has risen to the kind of gravity of abortion. And I do think that it is wise for bishops to consciously look for ways to make sure that they are not becoming an arm of either political party, right? Like and here is a way to do that. But he said, you know, there's no room for obscurantism here. We know about climate change. This is not conjecture. This is not what we know. And the Holy Father, you know, demonstrated that in that, you know, magnificent, you know, kind of concise chapter on the science of climate change in Laudato Si. And so I think there is something to be said for finding ways to draw connections. I'll give another example. Cardinal Tobin's neighbor across the way in the 2012 Al Smith dinner had used this construction where he said, you know, the church stands for the uns. Anybody who is in our society who is defined by what you lack. So the undocumented, the unemployed, the unborn, and he went through a whole long list. I take pride of place. He stole that from one of my columns. And I was happy to have it stolen because I think we have to look for those opportunities that really do testify to the fact that the gospel stands in judgment over ourselves and over our culture and over our decisions, not the other way around. It's not Plato. You can't just Plato, like, you know, the child's game, not Plato, the philosopher. That you can't just.
I'm very worried there for a moment.
I know you can't squeeze it into your tubes that you specifically want.
Well, let me follow that up with a question. According to a recent Pew Trust poll, only 1% of American voters listed abortion as the #1 important issue facing our society. And yet, when people talk about Catholic voters, abortion takes a pride of place in terms of the issues that are debated on both sides of this question. So this is a question, I guess, to all three of you. Is the Pew Trust wrong? Is the Pew Trust sort of like mistaken in believing that the vast majority of Americans do not consider abortion by itself the single overriding issue, or are people not, in fact, voting their consciences? Or how would you explain this wide gap between the 1% the Pew Trust found and the way that abortion has become sort of in some sense, in some circles, the defining Catholic issue in politics?
Well, I guess a part of it depends on how do you define defining Catholic issue. I think it's the issue that Catholics make the most noise about. If you're looking at at the internet, I think it's an issue that people have organized around and thought about since Roe v. Wade. Really, it's an issue on which the Church has a very clear stand, and it's an issue on which the Catholics have increasingly made common cause with evangelical Protestants. As a way of kind of creating a socially, kind of a socially conservative voting bloc. At the same time, I think about what I see on the internet, and I think about what I see and hear when I go to church, and it's almost as if they're two different, worlds. I'm sure there are people, and it might be greater than 1%, who say, I saw a study that said, 25%, won't vote for somebody who think that about abortion differently than they do. But, so there are different studies. But I do think the vast majority of people don't look at it in terms of one issue, but see these issues as interrelated, as creating a culture maybe that supports vulnerable people of all sorts, including women facing crisis pregnancies. And that's the other thing to say, I think, about abortion. And that comes back to what I was saying about what is an issue. An issue is a moral problem, but then you have a moral problem, and then you have to decide, well, how am I going to address that moral problem? And there are different ways of addressing it. One way of addressing it is to ban it, to criminalize it. Another way of addressing it is to minimize, kind of the demand side for abortion by providing women with other kinds of support. Some people propose combining those two things, but if you can't assume, and I think activists tend to assume that not only is their issue the most important issue, but their particular way of addressing it is the only way of doing that. And I think most Americans, politely beg to differ, quietly.
Thank you. I have about 100,000 questions more, but at this point, I want to field some questions from our viewing participants. So I'm going to turn this over to my very smart colleague at Trinity College, Hartford, Mark Silk. Mark, do we have any questions from the audience?
We do have some questions, and I think I have a question for each of our panelists, starting off with Cardinal Tobin. And this scoops up several questions, and I think this particular version expresses it quite well. Can a faithful Catholic vote for Biden? Yes or no? Another way to ask, how should Catholic social teaching inform our vote where one candidate is nominally pro-life but does not support the rest of Catholic social teaching on immigrants, the poor, healthcare, and the rights of minorities, and the other candidate party is pro-choice, supportive of LGBTQ issues, is in favor of healthcare for all, provides support for the poor, for immigrants, for the elderly? I think I'll leave it at that, but some people have tougher words for the Democratic side, but that's good enough.
There you go, Your Eminence. A nice, easy question for you.
Well, actually, there are two questions, and I think there are two different methods of trying to decide the question about who you're going to vote for. One is you want to reduce something to a yes or no, which I think is the ultimate question. It shouldn't be the first one. The first one, I believe, is the discernment regarding the common good. Now, I think in the I think it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. No political party represents fully the Catholic tradition, the Catholic moral tradition. In fact, I think in the two options we have on the national scene to the two political parties, there's serious reasons not to consider either party as being representative of the Catholic tradition. The problem is that we have to vote. Or we should vote. I think that, and it's not enough to say, well, I'll wait until somebody comes along with as close to 100% as I can get. And so I think a very important virtue in approaching that has been pointed out by Bishop McElroy, and I read that article as well, but also by other more classical or moral theologians, is the virtue of prudence. And prudence means that you weigh everything in the favor of the overweening value. And the overweening value here is the value, the common good of this political arrangement called the United States of America. And I don't think, first, that we can reduce, at least in the current panorama of issues, to how a candidate stands on a single issue, at least the ones that are before us now. I suppose if somebody was running on a nuclear war platform, advocating a Holocaust, that a worldwide incineration, that might be, the single issue that could make the discernment a lot easier. So here we have among the political options, we have people who not only don't support the Catholic tradition on abortion, but actually remove the unborn child from the moral equation. So we don't, it's simply whether can this right that has been attributed to people be vindicated or not, rather than, and so the unborn child is just going to be sitting there outside, but actually is gravely affected. We have other people that reduce or disguise the most vulnerable in society, some of those uns that Michael Shawn mentioned. I think of some of the rhetoric that is used in presenting many people that I serve here, and those are immigrants who were born somewhere else. And I think if you want to do heinous things to people, you have to actually take away their faces. You have to take away their significance. Because generally, if we recognize someone's face, our common humanity leads us to eschew certain options. If we hide those who are most affected by our moral choices, then we can do heinous things. So I'd say that I'm not going to say yes or no. I think that a person in good conscience could vote for Mr. Biden. I frankly, in my own way of thinking, have a more difficult time with the other option. But I do believe that this is a sacred act in which I think the compendium of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church calls voting the crossroads of where Christian life and conscience come into contact with the real world. And so we have to bring our not simply our stance on one issue, we have to bring our whole Christian outlook and moral tradition to bear on this choice we're going to make in November.
Thank you, Your Eminence. Marcus?
Yes, this question comes from Mike O'Loughlin, who I'm assuming is the national correspondent for America Magazine.
And an alumnus of St. Anselm's College.
Very good.
One of our co-sponsors.
And I'm gonna say that this question is directed to Michael Shawn. If he can speak about the influence of increasingly strident social media personalities as Catholics form their consciences ahead of voting, thinking of recent cases such as a priest going viral by saying Catholics cannot be Democrats, a view endorsed by at least one bishop and denounced by another, or the former papal nuncio endorsing President Trump.
Well, I insist on referring to the former nuncio as the disgraced former nuncio. who has endorsed Donald Trump's reelection. I don't get too excited about social media craziness. I think it's very easy to forget that Twitter is not the real world because it's instantaneous. There's so much information there. We've all come to rely on it. My worry is when it mainstreams. And so like that Father Altman, who the questioner refers to from La Crosse, Wisconsin, in this viral age, he gives this sermon and says all these crazy things, and it goes around. But it took off, I think, when Bishop Strickland, who was not his bishop, endorsed what he was saying. Bishop Strickland is somebody who's quite frequently interviewed on EWTN. So that's that crossover from a kind of, fringe group, and there are others, LifeSite News, Church Militant. When it crosses over, if through EWTN or some other means, in the case of Vigano, obviously the president himself retweeted the letter that Vigano had written to him. That's when I think the bishops have to stand up. And I've said this on the record. The new bishop in Birmingham and the bishops as a whole have to figure out what to do with EWTN. It is a problem. It reaches millions of Catholics, especially in this time of COVID. I visited outside a cousin of mine who's in a nursing home, and they really rely on that for information. And so if they are mainstreaming some of this crazy stuff, you have a real problem. If it stays on the fringe, you're always going to have the fringe. The poor you will always have with you, said the Lord. But when it starts getting mainstreamed to millions of Catholics, then you've got a problem.
All right. Here's a question from Phyllis Zagano, who is not a journalist, but writes for various publications, for Professor Kaveny. You mentioned competence and character as a requirement for office. Are both required, or can one or the other be overlooked? Or a better way to frame it, can issues even be considered if either competence or character are not present in the candidate?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question in one sense, but yes, I do think you need both competence and character. And under one way of phrasing it or framing it would be to say that, character is a type of competence. And in order to be able to, it's a moral competence. It's a moral ability to weigh in a prudential manner, the competing goods that are at stake in any complicated decision, and not put too much emphasis on self-interest or one's own financial gain or the gain of one's allies or one's voters, but to really focus on and be concerned about the common good, including, I think, for leadership in this country, the good of people who did not vote for you. I mean, I think one of the problems is we're losing the sense that the president is the president of the entire country, not just of the people who voted for him or her. So I think you need character, and I definitely think you need competence. If you've got somebody who, and competence may not be having a mastery of every jot and tittle of every problem everywhere, but it would be, do I know how to get the best people to advise me on this question? Do I know how to get people with different views to advise me on this question so I can hear both sides before I make a decision? And then am I going to make a decision according to what I think is the best answer rather than the person who seems to flatter my preconceived judgments? So competence and character are both necessary. And in fact, I think if you gave a thick description of how decisions are made, they fit hand in glove.
All right. We have a very softball question from Christopher White for Cardinal Tobin. That's a joke. And it goes like this. When some U.S. bishops visited Pope Francis earlier this year as part of their ad limina visits, they reportedly asked him whether he agreed that abortion was a preeminent priority. In recent weeks, some pro-Trump Catholic groups have even used language asking whether, do you agree with Pope Francis that abortion is the preeminent priority, unquote. What's your assessment of how this played out? Do you believe this was an effort to draw the Pope into a very divisive issue stateside without him being aware of the full context and internal discussions and happening among the full body of US bishops?
Well, I can say my friend Chris might have more information than I do. I was one of those bishops that visited Pope Francis actually last November. We talked about a lot of stuff. The bishops were in New Jersey and Pennsylvania during the ad limina visit. We didn't talk about preeminence. But I do think that much like the proof texting that goes on with the Word of God, you know, which can be marshaled to support all sorts of diametrically opposed positions, we shouldn't be afraid when they do it, when the poor successor of Peter gets pulled into it that way. I think what I would point out is that Pope Francis, and like Pope Benedict, had a great, places a great premium on the act of discernment, meaning that things are not immediately self-evident. And I think that he would encourage people to make their political decisions in the light of their faith, and not try to even use a pope as a sort of prop to their own moral discernment. He's a teacher, he's not a prop. And a teacher, I don't think, gets pulled into these very unhelpful reductions.
Here's a question from Tom Gelton of NPR, I believe. And I'm going to send this to Michael Sean. An NBC Marist poll released this month of likely voters in Pennsylvania found that Trump was favored over Biden among, quote, white practicing Catholics, unquote, by a margin of 69 to 28%, while Biden was favored among, quote, white non-practicing Catholics, unquote, by a margin of 60 to 35%. Do you have an explanation for that stark difference? And I guess anybody can weigh in on that one, but Michael Sean, go for it.
So I guess, you know, practice makes perfect. It depends on what you mean by practicing, right? I think it's well known that weekly Mass attenders tend to be older, tend to be more conservative, and therefore would be more likely to support a series of conservative talking points, would more likely have been exposed to, say, letters from a bishop. I saw the Bishop of Allentown issued a statement that was somewhat different from what we've heard from Cardinal Tobin today, where he did say, look, it's abortion, all or nothing. And so I do think you have to, you know, the religious liberty, look at how often we have heard that from our pulpits, or the letters from the bishops, or inserts, the Knights of Columbus are doing something, and all this for the past many years, and how it then got picked up at the Republican National Convention. On the other hand, you know, I take comfort, although I am a weekly Mass attender, I take comfort in the many gospel passages at which Jesus clearly identifies with the Catholics who probably don't make it, or the Jews of his time who probably didn't make it to shul every week, right? So I think the standard for being a good Catholic or a bad Catholic, I encourage everyone to go to Mass every Sunday. If I don't go to Mass on Sunday, I feel like a cat that fell and didn't land on all fours for the rest of the week. But I know that there are good and faithful Catholics who don't make it to Mass every Sunday. And I know, myself first included, there are many sinners who do go every Sunday. So I don't think there's, you should not say, well, therefore the devout are Republicans, right? Only in a certain type of devotion. And I think devotion to the life of the faith expresses itself in many ways, not just weekly church attendance. What will be interesting to see is to compare those numbers from 4 years ago, because Joe Biden, unlike, Hillary Clinton, despite the advice of many of her advisors, would not talk about her religion. And Joe Biden can't explain himself without talking about religion. You think of the personal tragedies he's gone through. And I think you will see that have a kind of totemic quality with many Catholics, including the weekly Mass attenders. That will be a strong counterweight to the totemic value, to go back to Mark's question about the 1% on abortion. It may only be the 1% that view it, but it has a totemic quality. People know where you stand on abortion. They think they know a lot about you on other issues as well. So we'll see how those all play out.
I just want to add something on that point. I think, we're talking about Catholics and voting, but I think that the question of who goes to Mass and who doesn't go to Mass also raises broader questions about who's alienated from the church and under what circumstances. And, in the Catholic Church, there isn't, at least in the United States, as much of a sense of here comes everybody as I would like to see, the sense that it's universal, that everybody is welcome and everybody is a pilgrim. A lot of the people who are saying, well, all the devout Catholics vote for Trump or vote for the Republicans are also, at least if you pay attention to the pundits, the people who say, well, if you don't believe the Catholic teaching on X, Y, Z, don't bother coming to church, you're not a good Catholic. So, there is a sense in which there seems to be, at least among the talking heads, a large group of Catholics who want a smaller, purer church, and they want it to be uniform on political and moral matters. And they make it quite clear that if you disagree on contraception, on homosexuality, if you put too much emphasis on climate change, or if you're worried in the wrong way about the clergy sex abuse crisis, don't bother coming back. The church is for, it's almost an evangelical Protestant view of, well, the church is for the people who are respectable, who are mainstream, who have stable marriages and stable kids, and anybody who has any doubts or any problems, stay away. So I think you have to ask, what's the messaging to the broader population, not just who shows up?
Marcus, we have time for one last question.
Yes, and I think we'll give Cardinal Tobin the last word. These are two related questions which I think really our audience should hear. And I'm going to read them sequentially. The first is, many in the audience are undergraduate students who may not have taken a course in Catholic social teaching. Can someone, and I'm going to say the Cardinal, explain briefly how can a Catholic person form her or his conscience in preparation for voting? How to use the common good as the criterion of discernment? And related to that, what specific steps may be taken in the seminaries and Catholic schools, as suggested by Michael Sean Winters, to assure that the other Catholic social teaching have at least an equal place with the apparent fixation of American bishops on the abortion issue?
Yeah. Could you repeat that last line there? I was distracted for a second, Mark.
That the other Catholic social teachings have at least an equal place with the apparent fixation of American bishops on the abortion issue.
Yeah. Well, I think the first is I'm grateful that somebody, whoever wrote the first part of that question, said, acknowledge that consciences are formed. We're not infused with a perfectly formed conscience at birth, and really I think our life is a life of continual conversion, as Paul says in his letter to the Philippians, which I like, leaving the past behind me, I strive to run the race and keep my eyes fixed on Jesus. So I think that this, as our pilgrimage of life continues, several things should inform us. I think one is certainly the Word of God. And the Word of God, not simply as it touches me, but the Word of God as it's welcomed and in our community of faith, and that our faith is illuminated by it. Secondly, I think a formed conscience is not immediately having a specific answer on many moral dilemmas. We have to, as someone talks about, a particular action as a mortal sin. I say, well, it could be a mortal sin, but it doesn't have to. I mean, it's not necessarily, because the other two, we remember from our basic catechism, that there also has to be sufficient reflection and adequate freedom on the point of the actor. So it's not simply the action in question. I like personally, and sometimes it's thrown in my face, but I like the metaphor that was used by my former Archbishop when I worked in Chicago, Joseph Bernardine, of the seamless garment. I think that, meaning that the Catholic Church recognizes an interrelatedness around the value of life, that there's a whole spectrum because of what we're facing in society today, including the ecological question, that are life issues. And so we have, by accentuating this interrelatedness, I don't think it's just avoiding an unnecessary and perhaps very unhelpful juxtaposition between the possibility of being against abortion and in favor of denying immigrants their rights or their dignity as human beings, or in proposing the death penalty as a legitimate choice in a moral choice, when there is a clear teaching from our Holy Father that it is not, as well as so he kind of closed what little ambiguity was left in that area. So as far as how to educate it, I think I always, I favor putting faces on issues. First the faces, and when you listen to the complexity of people's decisions, you have some idea of what the sort of reflection and support they're going to need from the community as we go forward. And that means we have to not take a dead end down a partisan trail, because no political party has a claim on the Catholic tradition. We have to judge each party and the actions of their proponents and their candidates with the fullness of our tradition. So I guess, in the seminaries as well, I favor an active pastoral life for our seminarians, so that they have some idea of what why they're studying. It's not simply for the joy of knowing theology, but it's actually the salvation of souls is the highest goal of that study. So yeah, I think that Alphonsus used to say that a problem in the church is when the confessors don't study and the professors don't hear confessions. So I think whether we're talking about academic faculty in a Catholic college or in a seminary, I think that interplay between the lived experience of human beings and the richness of our tradition is a place where we can then speak a language that people can understand as they're formulating their prudential judgments.
Thank you, Your Eminence. In the name of all the viewers, I want to thank the three really superlative panelists today, Cardinal Tobin, Cathy Kaveny, and Michael Sean Winters, for very, very interesting and thoughtful series of questions and answers. Two public service announcements. A recording of this webinar will be posted as a link at the websites of the three institutions that are sponsoring it. That is the Greenberg Center at Trinity College, Hartford, the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, and the Boisi Center at Boston College. And finally, I want to remind everyone that there are two webinars that will take place next week and the Tuesday afterwards. So the three webinars are all on Tuesdays. Next Tuesday's webinar on September 22nd will be entitled The Republican Party and Catholic Voters in 2020, and it will be convened by Neil Levesque, who's the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, Mark Roselle, who's the Dean of the School of Public Policy at George Mason, Heidi Schumpf, who's the Executive Editor at the National Catholic Reporter, and John Sununu, former Governor of New Hampshire and White House Chief of Staff. And the Tuesday after that, which is September 29th, also at 4 o'clock, will be entitled The Democratic Party and Voters in 2020. It will be convened by Mark Silk from the Greenberg Center and will feature Sean Casey, who's the director of the Berkeley Center at Georgetown, Tim Matovina, who's the chair of the Department of Theology at Notre Dame, and Joseph McKellar, who's the co-director of the PICO Institute in California. So again, in the name of everyone, I want to thank the three panelists, wish you all a good evening, and we will see you here next Tuesday at 4 o'clock. So do take good care of this strange time, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Mark.
Bye.